Hi there, my name is Michael, and I wanted to talk about a topic related to role-playing games that has been kicking around in my brain for quite a while. And that is the subject of novelty versus banality in video game settings. It's no surprise to anyone that's played these games that a typical RPG setting, medieval RPG setting, is in an analog for Western Europe, a place that could double for a fictionalized, mythologized version of medieval England, France, Germany, or Italy. And there are exceptions to that, of course, but that's overwhelmingly the choice that people make when they make these games, and it's the first thing that people think of when you think of a medieval role-playing game. And I've gotten some criticism in the past in other videos that I've done where I've suggested that perhaps people should expand, branch out from that, and, when I express my disdain for those kinds of settings, people have kind of hit back on me, but I wanted to talk about this subject. First and foremost, I think we need a little bit of history about role-playing games and why this setting is so important to the genre, not just in video games, but in everything. And it has to go back to the origin point of role-playing games. Where did they come from originally? Well, medieval role-playing games have their origin in 19th century Victorian Romanticism. In the 1700s, when people became disdainful of the medieval past and the barbarism and superstition and ignorance that typically attended it, the educated classes began to idolize ancient Greece and Rome as the proper foundation point for a civilization. And really, we haven't ever moved away from that because most of our modern democratic structures have some sort of origin point in the Greco-Roman world. But in the Victorian era, right after this time period, when there was a safe enough distance between themselves and the barbarous superstition attending not just the Middle Ages, but well into the modern era with witch burnings and religious violence, people began to look back nostalgically to the Middle Ages and try to establish, as part of their national heritage and culture, some sort of cycle of myths and beliefs and ideas and sort of a general, everything that we would say goes under the heading of culture, folk songs, stories, heroes, historical and mythological. And for some decades, the medieval era became very much in fashion, in vogue, even among the educated classes in Europe. And it was out of this point that people in the 20th century, like J.R.R. Tolkien or C.S. Lewis or Robert E. Howard, were continuing a Victorian era, very 19th century intellectual concept into the 20th century. And it was at this time when medieval romanticism sort of fell out of interest amongst the educated and was sort of relegated to a niche market, especially one that was pushed towards children. And that's what Gary Gygax and the people that created Dungeons & Dragons were also doing. They were using the myths and legends of Beowulf and King Charlemagne and the Crusades, and this mixture of this historical and the fanciful, the ideas of the Middle Ages are what fit most beautifully into an RPG. That era, the technology, the culture, what people believed, what people did, the idea of the questing knight comes from that era. Now there were heroes, of course, before then in the Greco-Roman world and before that in other cultures, but most particularly the RPG concept fits most beautifully into this era, into this time period. And that's the reason why we see it so often, and why we will always continue to see it. It's the origin point. This is the genesis of the RPG, of all RPGs, but specifically the medieval ones. This is where, this is its homeland, and it forever will be its homeland. It's always going to be the place that people go to, and they should, because it's the starting point. However, that doesn't mean that we can't branch out of that area. We can't leave and go to somewhere else. Just in medieval Europe, we could have gone, for instance, to a setting that was a little bit more like medieval Spain, where you could be part of the Muslim caliphate there, or the Christian opponents of it, and that dynamic of trying to create either a multi-religious society or trying to finally defeat and oppress and convert your foes. Or you could, even the Italian city-states are a little bit different from the standard feudal era. The Italian city-states had occasional democratic governments, the republics in Florence and so forth during that time period. And the Byzantine Empire was remarkably different than the Western European area. It was completely different technologically and especially on the social. One interesting one was Neverwinter Nights 2 Mask of the Betrayer, which was set in the land of Rashomon, which has a sort of Kievan Rus mixed Viking and Eastern European kind of flavor and sort of the pine forests of the Slavic areas of Europe, and it has a more primitive style and a different culture, and it's unique and it's interesting, and it was really fun that things were set in that area. I don't want to sound like some more pessimistic cultural critics have about this issue and sneeringly suggest that the RPG world has never branched out from that, because that is a ridiculous, nonsensical lie about the RPG world. We've seen, especially in Dungeons & Dragons, the main RPG force in the pen and paper world, branch out beyond Western Europe a number of times over the years, especially during what I consider the golden age of pen and paper role-playing games from the late 80s to the late 90s during the advanced Dungeons & Dragons era. Nowadays, we have a weird system where they seem to bring out a new edition of Dungeons & Dragons like a new video game console. They feel like they need to reassemble everything a couple of years in order to make it work better, functionally. But in a time period where they had sort of established the function with the second edition or Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, they began to work with that in order to create more worlds, to create more campaign settings and places to go. And that was really the main focus, which today I don't think it really is. During this time period, we saw the creation of an amazing number of fantasy landscapes. And they were very different from what we saw before. There was Al-Qadim, which was a medieval fantasy world with an Arabian Nights-like setting, and of course a Muslim medieval culture, probably the one that most directly fits in next to the medieval European culture, even though they were opposed to each other in the Middle Ages. And we got to mess around with genies and various Middle Eastern-style mythological entities and, interact with that type of culture. And there was also one called Kara-Tur, which was set in East Asia, specifically based on a world sort of like medieval Japan and China, but there were other East Asian elements there as well. In the Ravenloft horror campaign setting, we even got a world called Trivashti, which was a land that was based sort of on medieval India. They also had another one based on ancient Egypt in Ravenloft. We even got at this time period something called Maztica, which, as you might guess by the name, is something based on Mesoamerican, pre-Columbian Mesoamerican society. And so you could be in a sort of Aztec and Mayan world, and that was a completely new galaxy that was very, very different and unique. And, there was also one called the Dark Sun, which was based in a Iron Age, or not even Iron Age, Bronze Age setting where the god kings of Mesopotamia or ancient Egypt were ruling from their ziggurats in this blasted desert landscape, and there was very little metal. It was a really, really interesting campaign setting that I loved, and I wish that they would go back to. And occasionally games were based on these things. There was a couple of Ravenloft games. There was, I think, only one based on Al-Qadim, if I remember correctly. And there were a few Dark Sun games. So the pen and paper RPG world absolutely did go beyond that setting, and has been since at least the 1980s. Really, it's before that on an ad hoc basis, but on a big official basis of these campaign settings, it's been going on for decades now. Unfortunately, these games and these worlds did not necessarily sell all that well. As much as I liked so many of them, especially Planescape, they didn't really translate into financial success for the owners of D&D, and I think I can understand why. You see, there's an old joke about an English tourist who decides to see the world, and so he packs his bags, gets on a ship, goes to a faraway land, and spends his entire time there with other tourists talking about how much they miss England. And that can be sort of an issue when it goes to these branching off outside of the central homeland of medieval role-playing games. people get a little bit scared and a little bit worried going to areas that are radically outside typically what we see in the fantasy role-playing game setting. And there's nothing wrong with wanting one in that setting. It is the traditional setting, and it's fine. But they can be a little bit scared about moving outside of that. And I also want to make it clear that I'm not like some cultural critics who have a tendency to suggest that novelty equals value, that just because something is new and different, it's better. I don't agree with that. I think that something can be new and different and exciting and unique and be terrible and be completely unworthy of your time. And something that is absolutely traditional could be incredible. It depends. Novelty is not automatically good. And there's always going to be, of course, the first time, the first time someone really sets down and plays one of these medieval role-playing games. And I think that older cultural critics who have been playing these games all their lives may forget that, they were a kid once who was 11 or 12 years old and was setting down to do this for the first time. And they may not want to do some sort of weird spin or variation or branching off into some, very unique and very different world the first time they go out. So it's always going to be there. But I don't think people should be encouraged necessarily to enjoy constant familiarity. And that, unfortunately, I think has an effect of continuing banality in these settings, continuing the repetitious world of going back to the thing that we all know and love again and again and again. Like a security blanket, we just want the same thing to be there to comfort us. A major reason why we keep seeing this setting is because it's easy. It's something that's been done 1,000 times before, and we can just do this again and again like that without much work, without much stylistic change, and without much help. We don't really need to put a lot of effort into it, and that, because companies are out there to make money, is something that is very attractive to them and something that they really want to take advantage of. Another major reason is actually a technical one in the gameplay because, as I mentioned before, the homeland of Western Europe of these RPGs, it works for the absolute best in that area. And when you branch out of it and see technological and cultural differences in the lands that you're trying to explore, it can be somewhat difficult to do. Because there is an amazing Pathfinder campaign. I don't know if it would be a campaign setting exactly, but it's set in a sort of pre-modern Africa, like tropical Africa type world. And it was really, really cool to read this, and it would be really fun to play. But I also realized that, are you going to necessarily find a local blacksmith in tropical Africa? There were iron workers there, but you wouldn't be able to find plate metal, would you? You wouldn't be able to find all of this wide array of very familiar types of weapons and armor in that area, unless maybe there was like a colonial settlement at one area that you could find where you can get the more stereotypical European style stuff. And they would have a radically different culture in terms of religion and government that were very, very different, and you'd have to learn about and adapt to. And maybe people wouldn't want to necessarily do that, and it wouldn't work as well with the questing band of adventurers thing. Would you even find like a tavern to go to in, subtropical Africa? I mean, maybe you would, but you might not really be able to discover all of the familiar places, ideas, and items that you would find in a more traditional setting. Although that wouldn't stop you in a setting in medieval India or anywhere in East Asia or Southeast Asia or the Middle East where things were much, much more similar. I don't know how you would even do it really in a Mesoamerican style culture, because, there would be virtually no metalworking of any kind. They were using obsidian weaponry and linen or cotton style breastplates. They weren't really using anything even remotely like what we would traditionally use. So you would have to really adapt yourself to something very, very different. I also think that there might be a problem in the game design world of using different areas, because unfortunately they get you coming and going with this. They could accuse you of not straying out of the stereotypical world of medieval Europe, but then when you do, you would probably be viciously attacked by a large number of people who would excoriate any company that set their world in a sort of stereotypical fantasy version based on India or China and harshly criticize them for stealing their culture. which is a despicable thing that is keeping people from making games in those settings and forcing people once again into this little box. People might angrily denounce a Western game company, because that's where most of them are, making something in a version of the medieval Middle East. Of course, all of the Western European ones are just a highly stereotyped, cherry-picking and mining the medieval European past for different ideas and monsters and items and things. So they would be doing the exact same thing with the Middle Eastern one, but they'd probably be harshly attacked anyway. But moving on from that, I think that after giving all of this history and all of these problems, I still want to firmly state that one of the things that I yearn for the most in an RPG game is something new and different. And there are many attendant problems and a lot of understandable issues with moving outside of the stereotypical Western European fantasy setting. And yet, I really, really want people to try as hard as they possibly can when they make these games, and for the gaming community to encourage them to try to branch out from that world into new and different settings. One based on, like, the Pathfinder one in subtropical Africa, or the Middle East, or what if one was set in a version of the steppes of Central Asia during the rise of Genghis Khan. You could see, one of the biggest things I want to see is unique flora and fauna, and a huge part of RPG games is travel. That's a huge part of adventure. A tiny proportion of what you're doing is actually killing the monsters and getting the loot. A huge amount of what people did back in the actual Middle Ages and later in the Age of Exploration is travel. It's how do I get from point A to point B without dying? And then, of course, I may get to point B, and when I get there, I may be killed, like Magellan was. He spent all of this time trying to get into the Pacific Ocean, and he actually reaches the Philippines, so circumnavigating the globe, and then he's immediately killed by a bunch of people in the Philippine Islands. It sucks, but that's what happened. And so the world and the setting itself is something that I find even more important than things like characterization and plot and story. That's why I want to see it done. I think that Skyrim, one of the reasons why it was so popular was that it brilliantly managed to combine novelty with familiarity. The Viking world of Skyrim, it's similar enough to the medieval Western European world of France, England, Germany, and Italy, that people are not going to feel out of sorts there, but it's also just different enough with the woolly mammoths and the saber-toothed tigers and walruses to make you feel like this is a new place. It had this magnificent blend of the two things, and that was incredible, and one of the reasons I think why it was so successful. So anyway, please tell me in the comments below what your experiences are with RPGs, and if you want to expand outside of the stereotypical RPG world like I do, and, how much you yearn for seeing those, if you do, or if you don't care, if you think that it's totally irrelevant and unimportant, what sort of setting we have geographically, what kind of flora and fauna we have, like, what kind of world would you ideally like to see, and, tell me why you think we don't see that as much. Do you agree with my opinion? Do you think there's things I missed? I want to know about that in the comments below so we can start talking about why we don't see things from a completely different perspective. I've been attacked a few times in my videos, especially when I've talked about Neverwinter Nights or Planescape, for, just condemning the Western European style stereotypical RPG world, which I did not exactly intend to do. I'm still willing to play a game in that. I just want something a little bit farther. I want something a little bit more than that. I can see why there hasn't been an Elder Scrolls game made, for instance, in the Khajiit world of Elsewhere, where you'd be walking around exclusively with cat people, or the Argonian world, where there'd just be lizard people in a giant swamp. I can kind of understand that. So please tell me in the comments below what you think about this, what you think that we should do to change that, if it's something we should change at all. I'm going to be leaving a few more videos here, by the way, of reviews of RPG games that I have done. My name is Michael. Please like, comment, and subscribe. I will be making more videos about RPG games, other video games, movies, television shows that I really like. And yeah, thank you very much and have a good night.